international affairs, she took several high-profile tours to Russia, and she knows Russia, some parts of Russia better than I do. As for Russian studies, Dr. Piner is the best specialist in Russia, Russian politics, and Russian history that South Africa has produced. So, here we go.
That was extreme. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Oh, good. Well, one of the great joys of my professional life, from which I can now look back on rather a few decades, I think one of the greatest privileges and pleasures that I have had in being around when South Africa and Russia resumed they never had a relationship much before, but when diplomatic relations were founded in 1991 and 2, was that I got to know some Russian academics very well, including dear Irina, who I think we're all very privileged to have with us here in Cape Town, and her colleague Apollon Davidson, with whom she has written several books, apart from books on her own, on South Africa and Russia. And I'll be actually talking from some of those as I go through this talk today. Now, the Bolshevik Revolution looked at from an outsider's point of view. What Irina gave you yesterday was very much the insider's view, and as a foreigner indeed, it is my privilege to give you an outsider's view of what the Bolshevik Revolution has meant, and particularly what it has meant to the West, by which, for the purposes of this lecture, because it's a very loose term, because of my areas of research and so on, I really do mean Western Europe and the United States of America, what the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution has been, particularly on Western Europe and the United States of America. And it has certainly been one of the most significant events of the 20th century, if not, many people would say, the most significant event of the 20th century, the Bolshevik Revolution. If you think of it, at the time, there was a terrible world war going on, and in the middle of it, this cataclysmic revolution happened, whose leaders promised to make no less than 1/6 of the world's land surface, which is what the Russian Empire was, into a completely different country, one with a society and a political system which had never been seen in the world before, based on the theory of someone called Karl Marx and others, who people perhaps knew a little bit about. And what is more, a country that was by its very nature inimical to everything that Western governments at the time stood for. So it came as something of a shock, but it came in the middle of a world war. So maybe at the time, it was just one of many shocks. Now, I'm going to take a slightly different line and say, yes, it was a very significant event, quite possibly the most important of the 20th century. But where Russia's relations with the West are concerned, my view is that the West has always found Russia very difficult to deal with. Its search for a reasonable Russia to do business with, as Mrs. Thatcher put it, started centuries ago, when links first developed between Western Europe and Russia. It went certainly long before 1917, and with Mr. Putin, who a lot of people think about today, it still continues today. So the Bolshevik Revolution complicated things, but it's always been a tricky relationship. Here, for instance, is shortly after Russia and the West really started to sort of link up together in the 1600s, a delegation of Russian merchants and princes to some of the German principalities. And if you read contemporary accounts, you will see that people found the Russians very different from themselves. It wasn't so terribly geographically far, but here were people who dressed quite differently, who were very suspicious of the outside world, who in many ways, and this is something that is a theme that runs through the way the West looks at Russia, and in the way Russia looks at itself, sort of Eurasian, not purely European, but with a strong Asian element to it. A country that was subject to the Russian Orthodox Church, unfamiliar in many ways within the Christian community, governed by capricious and very tyrannical rulers. At this time, Ivan IV, better known to us outsiders as Ivan the Terrible, a very terrifying ruler indeed, was on the throne in Moscow. So capricious and all-powerful rulers, and often very paranoid about the outside world. And although in the centuries that followed this embassy here, there were links, a lot of links between the West and Russia, increasingly in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Marquis de Custine, who went to Russia in the 1830s and wrote a lengthy book called Letters from Russia, said, and he was looking at the court of Nicholas I, who wasn't one of the more amiable monarchs that Russia's had on the throne, "I found only the reign of silence maintained by fear." This was Custine in the early 19th century, a rather democratic-minded Frenchman, having a look at the way Russia was run. Nevertheless, because of Russia's size, because of its military strength, at least in terms of numbers, because of its great natural wealth above all, obviously it was too big to be ignored. And by 1914, and of course there were, as you know, were attempts to invade it. The Swedes in the 17th century and early 18th century, of course Napoleon in the 19th century, and by 1914, when World War I broke out, which brings us up to what we're really talking about, despite many obvious defects, Russia was one of the 5 European great powers, ruled by, as we saw yesterday, what I would call a reactionary and dim-witted Tsar, but nevertheless one of the great 5 powers and an ally in World War I of Britain and France. That was the line up, if you like, in 1914. Russia, Britain and France on one side, leaving a few minor states out of it, and on the other side, Germany, Austria-Hungary and Turkey. Those were the so-called Central Powers. And Russia was far less well prepared for war than were its Western allies, and certainly than the Germans. In everything other than sheer numbers, it was often known as the Russian steamroller, simply because they had, through a vast conscription mechanism, almost an endless supply of undertrained and under-equipped soldiers that they could bring to the front, but very ill prepared in many ways. When the first revolution, which we talked about yesterday, the February Revolution occurred in 1917, Russia was already in deep trouble. The Germans were making deep inroads into Russia. A great offensive against the Austro-Hungarians in Eastern Europe had failed recently. And so when the February Revolution occurred, it was warmly welcomed by Britain and France, because what they saw was people that they thought they could really do business with. The people who led the February Revolution, which the Tsar abdicated, were Democrats. They promised to make Russia into a real parliamentary democracy, a country which the West would be far more easily able to understand and deal with. And so they recognized the provisional government of Russia very quickly as the legal government of Russia. And the provisional government promised, and this was an extremely unpopular promise in Russia, to keep Russia in the war against the Germans. Now, just at about this time, February, March, April of 1917, the Americans were about to join the war. And the President of the United States at the time was Woodrow Wilson, a great Democrat and liberal, and appealing to Congress for a vote to allow America to go into the war in April 1917, he said of the new Russia, which would be America's ally, "Here is a fit partner for a league of honor." And duly, America went into the war. Hardly 6 months later, as we heard yesterday, Lenin and the Bolsheviks took over. And this presented the West, now including the Americans, with a most terrible problem. Well, actually 3 problems. The first problem was that they desperately needed to keep Russia in the war. If you look at this map here, you can see the 2 fronts. The Western Front, which, as you know, was more or less static for most of the war and was the most terrible thing, and then the Eastern Front, by which stage I told you the Germans had made huge inroads into Russian territory, and the Eastern Front was here. Now, if Russia left the war, and one of Lenin's 3 promises was peace, land, and bread, So he was definitely going to take Russia out of the war. They were going to be stuck with a terrible problem, because then the Germans, of course, would be able to move their forces westwards and combine with what they already had there, and the war in the West would become very much more difficult. So the first thing was they desperately needed to keep Russia in the war. And in that they failed, and they failed quite quickly. Lenin was as good as his promise. Here in Brest-Litovsk, now on the frontier between Poland and Belarus, met the delegations. It's quite an amusing picture, actually, if you look at it closely. The Germans on one side, and it included, oh dear, now I'm really going wrong. It included the Prince of Bavaria, amongst others, so they were a fancy lot. And on the other side, over here, we have the Soviet delegation. Note it includes a woman. That was pretty well unheard of, wasn't it? Amazing things the Bolsheviks wanted to do. And it also included, of course, a lot of very revolutionary people. Initially, it was led by a man called Joffe, who was far too nice to the Germans in Trotsky's view, so Trotsky came and took over. And he said, I made it known I did not want to meet the Prince of Bavaria. He wanted to get on, sign a peace treaty, as harsh as it would be for Russia, and get out of the war. And that's exactly what happened in March 1918. So the Western Allies had lost out on that one. Large quantities of Allied war material was the next problem. I'm going to go on to the next slide because we really need a map. This is the best one I could find, unfortunately. In the ports of Murmansk, which is up on the White Sea, up there, and Archangel, and over here at Vladivostok on the Pacific coast were large amounts of American, British and French war material, largely British actually, worth many millions, which had been sent to the Russians and it hadn't been paid for by the Tsarist government, and it was now just rotting on the quaysides, and the Allies wanted it back. So this is the only reason why Woodrow Wilson, at any rate, was prepared to land any troops in Russia at all, and we'll come back to that in due course. Now, the last and most tricky of all, really, of the challenges that the Western Allies faces was ideological, because the Bolsheviks hated everything they stood for. They repudiated the debts of the previous regime. They rubbished all the shares that were held mainly by very middle-class French people who'd invested in Russia and bankrupted them. They nationalized foreign enterprises. And, of course, they hoped and expected and confidently looked towards and would help revolution to spread worldwide and all the governments of the West to be overthrown. And not only in the West, but also in the colonies. They wished to have the empires of Britain and France and others overthrown as well. They published the texts of the secret treaties that the Allies had signed with Russia, which caused a great scandal. And what is more, there were revolutions almost immediately in Hungary. A Marxist revolution actually held power. Whoopsie, I'm always doing this, aren't I? Sorry, I must get this right. That's the pointer. In Hungary over here, there was actually a Marxist government in power for about 2 months, 3 months, something like that. It looked as though maybe the revolutions really were starting to spread already. So it really was very problematical. And this meant that most of the leaders of the Western governments were pretty anti-Bolshevik, but yet they had to deal with this. This was a factor of the situation. As long as the war went on, they had a real problem. Because they had to try and get in there and deal with it. So if we come now to this map and we look and we can see, what happened really was almost immediately resistance started up in various parts of Russia against the Bolsheviks. The area in pink is the bit that was held by the Bolsheviks who moved their government to Moscow early in 1918, and was on the whole held by them throughout the Civil War, which went on until 1921. The rest of Russia, and the orange bits on the left and so on, was where a lot of the fighting took place, and also in Siberia. There is no time, unfortunately, and I wish there was, to go into what the Civil War was all about and what Allied intervention really meant. It's a fascinating story. The Americans, the British, the French, and the Japanese, remember Japan was also, I left Japan out, was also an ally of the Britain, France, and America in World War I, not in World War II, of course. All landed their forces, and Within the British forces, indeed, were some South Africans, and there are some stories about particularly a man called Kenneth van der Spey, who later in life owned Old Nectar in Stellenbosch, and his adventures, because he actually flew a Sopwith camel up in the northern sphere from Archangel, and his plane came down. He was captured by the Bolsheviks and held in Moscow for quite a few months, and his story is a fascinating one. So South Africans were actually involved too. Now, there were three main areas of Allied intervention in the north, in Archangel and Murmansk, up there where I pointed before. The Allies landed troops, mainly American and British troops, and to protect the Allied war material that was there. They also got involved in some fighting. Here are some American soldiers who were in Murmansk for quite a while. The second area in which, and that was the most complicated, and from a story point of view, but we can't go into it, much the most interesting, was in Siberia. And on the coast at Vladivostok, on the Pacific coast, you remember I showed you where Vladivostok was on the map? These are American troops landing. Now, it's the end of the war. We're now talking 1918. War came to an end, of course, as you know, in November that year. And the Allies are having to land forces in Russia and get themselves involved in a civil war. The third area, let me just go back to the map, where there was a lot of activity was down in the south, around the Black Sea and in Ukraine. The Germans at that stage occupied most of this area, and there was a whole lot of complications going on with Ukraine. But basically there was fighting and white forces in the south as well, and there were also the British Navy played quite a major part in that campaign too. So it's complex and a very dramatic and interesting story. In the end, I've got another picture to show you quickly. Yes, this is an interesting character, one of the most interesting. He was an admiral of the Black Sea Fleet, but he landed up as dictator of Siberia. He was anti-Bolshevik, wasn't in favor of the Tsar, but he was a very strong dictator. His name was Admiral Kolchak, and he landed up before a firing squad on the iced river outside Omsk in the early months of 1920, so that was the end of him. The war was extraordinary because it wasn't just whites versus reds. One day maybe I'll give you 5 lectures on the Civil War, which is very exciting and dramatic. There were all sorts of other people involved. There were bandits, there were nationalists, there were Cossacks. There were really some of the most extraordinary renegade horrendous people that you could possibly imagine. And the Bolsheviks had a real time of it. Trotsky, who started off as Minister of Foreign Affairs, or Commissar for Foreign Affairs, very soon became Commissar for a war and formed the famous Red Army. And the Red Army finally triumphed, and by early in 1921, the Civil War had come to an end. Now, they won the Civil War, Bolsheviks did, for many reasons, and I haven't got any time to go into that. The defects in Allied intervention was only one. The decision-making about the Allied intervention was very confusing. Many of the participants had different aims. Some of the military men on the ground got involved with unsuitable sort of fighters and gave help where they shouldn't have done. It was very unpopular in Europe and America. The war was over. In the case of Britain and France, their men had been fighting already for 5 years, and they didn't want them to go on fighting any longer. There is a story that the British troops at Dover, who were being embarked to go and be part of Allied intervention in Russia, actually mutinied and refused to go on board. It certainly was very unpopular. A lot of the soldiers I read and the British force up in the north were under 19 years of age, and it wasn't normally considered right to send soldiers under 19 out of the United Kingdom. So it was a very unpopular thing, and it left a bitter taste, of course, in Russia for many years to come, and fruitful source of propaganda. As late as 1986, you all remember Mikhail Gorbachev. He wrote a book called Perestroika, in which he explained to us ignorant people outside what perestroika was all about and why it was going to be such a good thing. And he wrote in that about the rude meddling of imperial forces in our history. So it's still coming up at that stage, right at the end of the 20th century. The Allies also, to try and get the Bolsheviks out, and some people in the British government, like Churchill's the obvious one, and Curzon, who was Foreign Secretary for quite a lot of the time, were desperate. They wanted a real force to go in and get the Bolsheviks out then and there. So there were other things too. There was a blockade. Nothing was allowed into or out of Russia. There was a naval and land blockade. This led to terrible starvation. Irina referred to that yesterday. Friedrich Nansen actually was sent in 1920-21 to try and help with these poor, starving people in Russia. The numbers who died in the Civil War were many millions, and a lot of children were just abandoned. And those that survived became orphans and lived rough. These children, as it says in French below, who've been living on tree bark and grass and worms and all sorts of things like that, it says it's too late for them, they're going to die anyway. So it was a very, very ghastly and tragic and terrible event for people in Russia. And the blockade was one reason for that, but not the main one, it has to be said. Irina talked yesterday about the forced deliveries of maize from the peasants, of grain from the peasants and so on. There was an embargo on loans to the government, as you can imagine. They wouldn't pay back the Tsarist debts anyway, so no one was going to lend them any more money. And also there was absolutely no recognition of the Bolshevik, the Soviet government, as we must now call it, I think, in Moscow. Now, when the Civil War was over, I think we must just stop for a minute and see how the Bolsheviks in Moscow saw their situation, let's say in 1921. I think it's important to remember that Lenin and his colleagues did not want or expect Russia to survive as a state for very long. Their expectations were entirely different. And their expectations were different because Marxist theory led them to believe two things. First of all, that there was likely to be a world revolution. Once you had revolution in one country, and Russia was not where Marx expected it to start, it would spread. And it would spread particularly through the industrial proletariats of countries like Germany and Britain. And eventually, the whole world would become a workers' paradise, let's put it that way, and there would be no need for states because the workers would be in an international brotherhood of the proletariat. Another reason was because Marxist theory also said that the state would wither away. There was no need for the state. Once you have a totally classless society, the state would cease to exist, it would have no point. So they weren't really expecting, when they came to power, they could see they had to fight to exist then. They didn't expect that Russia was going to have a very long history as a state all by itself in what turned out to be a very hostile environment. But this was not the case. By 1921, Lenin and his colleagues could see that they had, first of all, to control their own country with an iron fist, which they weren't about doing. And secondly, the world revolution wasn't going to happen anytime soon. Russia, which became known as the USSR officially in 1923, would have to get strong and operate as a state in the conventional fashion for the foreseeable future. Now, in order to do this, and it would be a socialist state progressing towards the communist paradise, if they could ever get there, and its main task was most certainly to promote world revolution, and Irina referred yesterday again to the Communist International, which was started in 1919, almost as soon as it was possible to set up any such organization to encourage revolution not only in the developed world but also in the colonies and in the third world. But nevertheless, in the meantime, Moscow could see that they had to normalize relations with the West. And in order to do that, they had to make relations with the Western governments. They had to trade. They had to get loans, which they were desperately in need of, and for foreign currency. And they had, if they could, to get recognition so that they would operate as a normal state. Now, the first Commissar for Foreign Affairs was Trotsky, before he went off to be Commissar for War. Trotsky remarked, I love it, he said, "My job is to issue a few revolutionary proclamations and then I'll shut up shop." That was, he said, it's going to be no need, we won't need a foreign minister, what for? You know, we're all going to be brothers. Okay, it didn't work like that. So from, in fact, 1918 already, a career diplomat from an aristocratic background called Georgy Chicherin became the foreign minister. And he was followed after by names that you'll probably remember, such as Litvinov, and then we get to Molotov and so on, and Mr. Gromyko. The Soviet Union had a Minister of Foreign Affairs. But there were really major problems. The fact that they refused to pay debts or recompense people who'd lost everything when the Bolshevik Revolution happened and everything was nationalized made it very difficult for Western governments who relied, after all, they were democracies and there was a free press, they relied on public opinion for their support to establish very close and friendly relations with Moscow. And after all, in the early 20s, Comintern, Communist International, was extremely active. The British government was extremely angry. There were several crises between London and Moscow at this time because Moscow established diplomatic relations quite early with Persia, and also with Afghanistan, which was an independent kingdom in those days. And what the British government called Indian seditionists were passing in and out of India, and doubtless a lot of them coming up to Moscow at that stage too, via these countries. And this made the British government absolutely furious, of course. The Western governments were pretty, as I've said, they had to watch their electorate, and they were divided about what to do. In the British government, certainly, the Prime Minister for much of this early period was Lloyd George, who was quite pragmatic about the Soviet Union. But the Foreign Office was normally rather anti. It tended to be more conservative. And in the very early period, Churchill was actually war minister. As soon as the war ended, Lloyd George said he had to do something with Winston, so he made him Minister for War. He thought that was a good thing. Nothing much for him to do now there wasn't a war. Well, Winston kept himself very busy. And one of the ways he did was writing a lot of very angry stuff about the Bolsheviks. He called them, crocodiles with human minds, and he talked about the foul baboonery of Bolshevism. He had, as you know, ways with language, did Churchill. It was going to be quite difficult for Moscow to do this. And the Americans, of course, after the war, as you may remember, retreated, as they may well be going to do again, onto their great continent, and did not want to have anything much to do with Europe at all. And certainly for the first 10 years of the interwar period, the Americans were really quite out of what was going on in Western Europe. Gradually, though, the Soviet Union did find its place in the normal community of nations, if you could call it that, in a period, of course, when international relations were anything but normal. We have Mussolini in Italy. From 1933, we have Churchill, do we not? Oh, Churchill, good Lord. Hitler, sorry. That's a very odd association there in Germany. So it wasn't a normal period. One of the first shocks, actually, to the British and the French was in 1922 when the Russians and the Germans, poor little Weimar Germany, who'd recently been defeated and laden with heavy reparations and so on, announced that they'd signed a treaty, the Treaty of Rapallo, and they had diplomatic relations with each other. They'd have been much more shocked if they'd known that 6 months earlier, the Russians and the Germans had signed a secret agreement whereby the Germans were manufacturing various war materials, including aeroplanes, in Russia, using their money and their technology, but Russian workers, to get round the Treaty of Versailles, which of course did not allow Germany to make any war materials at all. So that was a bit of a shock too. Trade relations, as usual, did precede diplomatic relations. From 1921, effectively, Britain and Russia were trading with each other quite legally. And from 1923, in fact, the Americans as well. Now, in 1924, something quite interesting happened in England. This is a man called Ramsay MacDonald. He was the first Labour Prime Minister of Great Britain. His party, the Labour Party, won the general election of 1924. And many people in the Labour Party were very sympathetic to the Soviet Union. And he decided that it would be the correct thing to do to recognise the Soviet Union. So in 1924, Britain and the USSR officially started diplomatic relations, exchanging ambassadors and doing all the things that you do. It didn't last long because they fell. They didn't have a majority in Parliament. They fell at the end of the year. There was a new general election at the beginning of 1925, and the Conservatives had one of their lovely little slogans was, "Bolshevik, Bolshevik, where have you been? Over to England, where the Reds are still green." Anyway, be that as it may, the diplomatic relations continued till 1927, when there was probably a fabricated spy scandal, and the Russian trade headquarters in London were raided by the British police, and compromising material was found, and relations were cut off. Not for long. By the 30s, both America and Britain had established diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, and so had the French. And in 1934, just when it ceased to have any significance at all, the Soviet Union joined the League of Nations. Now, the other bit I really want to talk to you about today is the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution on political and intellectual life in the West. And let's talk about politics first. Communist parties appeared very quickly in most European countries and in America as well. Also in South Africa, you'll be hearing more about that tomorrow, in 1921. The British Communist Party was formed in 1920, the American even earlier in 1919. The Communist Party of Great Britain played a major role in the general strike, you remember, of 1926. It had quite a few MPs at one stage in Parliament, but the last two were elected in 1945, and there were never communist MPs after that in the British Parliament. There were, however, local councillors. Right up in 2015, the last communist councillor alive had to hand over office in Fife. And so it did go on in Britain, and there is still a Communist Party, reformed in 2008, in fact. The old Communist Party apparently collapsed. They formed a new one, but it's very small. The American Communist Party, now you don't think of Americans and communism very easily together, do you? Because we all grew up in the Cold War period. Here is Earl Russell Broder. That name may ring a bell. Browder. Now, Earl Russell Broder started the Communist Party of America. He stood for president in 1936 against F.D. Roosevelt, and he didn't, of course, make it. In fact, despite anti-communist measures, which in America have been considerable, there's still a Communist Party of the USA to this very day. That is extraordinary, isn't it? I found it hard to believe. One reason some of you may have heard the name Browder recently is because of a book called Red Notice. That's right, thank you, Red Notice. This chap, Bill Browder, is actually his grandson, Earl Russell Browder's grandson. And if you read the book, he went to started a hedge fund in Moscow and fell foul of Putin, and it's quite an exciting book to read. He actually talks quite a lot about his grandfather and his early memories of him then. So there you are. The Americans actually fielded presidential candidates in most elections, this is for the Communist Party, until 1984, when 36,000 Americans voted Communist in 1984. Isn't that interesting? Now, established socialist parties, like the British Labour Party that we were looking at a minute ago, were now under attack, not only from the traditional conservative right, but also from the far left, from the communist far left. And this made life very difficult for them. Nowhere more so, in fact, than Germany, where, as you know, one of the reasons that Hitler could come to power was because the German Socialist Party, which had been enormously powerful historically going right back to the 1870s and 80s, was fighting with the Communist Party as well as, of course, with Hitler. Now, what about the effect of this revolution on people and ideas? It's hard, I think, to overemphasize, we're so used to it now, 100 years down the line, but to overemphasize the complete novelty of everything about the Soviet Union in its early and idealistic years. It was a time, particularly in the first half of the 1920s, a really immensely exciting culturally, intense innovation and experimentation in all the arts. In art, in theatre, in writing, in poetry, quite extraordinarily revolutionary and exciting material was coming out. It was a completely new kind of society that the Bolsheviks promised to form, a classless society in which the state would run the society, one society as the representative of the people. Some people in the West, mainly younger ones, tired of their very elitist governments, people like Churchill and Curzon, for instance, which had led them into a terrible war, and then into a post-war culture. Think about the 1920s in Western Europe. Think about the very, very materialist culture, I think. And then, of course, we had the great slump, of course, of 1929. It seemed like a new society and a new beacon. They fell heavily for it, a lot of them. Many prominent left-wing intellectuals in Europe and America visited the USSR at this time. Few, it has to be said, retained their enthusiasm for very long. Here is a man called John Reed. Now, John Reed is quite extraordinary. He was a young socialist in America from a very privileged background. He went to Harvard. Do some of you remember seeing a film called Reds? Yeah, that's right. If ever you get hold of a copy of Reds, it's well worth having a look at, about the young left-wing Americans who took to the enthusiasm about the USSR, and most of all John Reed. He died in 1920 at the age of 33 in the Soviet Union of disease, but not before he'd been back to America, having been in Russia at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution and chronicled 10 days that shook the world. Have any of you read that? If you have, you will know that it is the most extraordinary eyewitness account, very detailed, but an extraordinary eyewitness account of what went on in Petrograd in those 10 days in late October and into early November by the old calendar. And it's well worth a read if you can get hold of it. It's really exciting. So John Reed was one. I see in The Guardian that his book, 10 Days That Shook the World, is 47 out of 100 of the world's best non-fiction books, someone says. And John Reed, if you go to Moscow and you still want to visit Lenin, and you come out the other side onto the Kremlin, below the Kremlin walls, where distinguished communists and Russians are buried. There are a few foreigners, and one of them you'll see as you walk along is John Reed's tombstone is there. So he was buried at the Kremlin Wall, which is the ultimate honor, particularly for a foreigner. Another British socialist, very well known, Beatrice and Sidney Webb, the great Fabians and founders of the Labour Party and of LSE, the London School of Economics, went, and although not entirely enthusiastic, came back particularly enthusiastic for, I think, the theoretical side of what the USSR was all around. They wrote an enormous book called Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, which came out, its first edition was in 1937. At that stage, it had a question mark, a new civilization. And in subsequent editions, and I've got the 1941 edition, the question mark has gone. So you are to think that it is a new civilization. It's interesting, although the book is very uncritical, Beatrice Webb's diaries, which are fascinating, about her trip to the USSR, and they are digitalized and available online from the London School of Economics archives. She is much more critical, actually. I read that and was quite surprised to see what some of her comments were. H.G. Wells, you all know him, he visited and gave, again, a much more critical view, I think, but a very interesting interview that he had with Lenin while he was in Russia in 1920. Lincoln Steffens, a journalist, accompanied an American called Bullitt, who was sent to Moscow by the American government in 1919. And despite having seen the country in terrible times, when he came back, he wrote a lot of articles, and he coined that famous phrase, "I have seen the future and it works." Well, anyway. So many, in fact, a lot of people were so blinded by the vision that they failed to see the reality. And nowhere is this more true than some of the journalists who went to Russia in the 1930s when Stalin had taken over and there was terrible famine, particularly in Ukraine and southern Russia again, and who managed to go around and see things and write. There was particularly a man who worked for the New York Times, Walter Duranty, and said there was no famine. He didn't see any problems at all, whereas other people went and said they'd never seen anything like it. So a lot of people almost didn't see what they didn't want to see. Moving on a little bit time-wise, you may remember the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 9. Now, many young people were horrified. Whatever, communism appeared to them. If it was a choice between fascism and communism, they would take communism any time. When the Spanish Civil War broke out, 40,000 young people in Britain, America, and France, and a few other countries too, joined up in the International Brigade to fight in defense of the Republican government, which was supported by the USSR against Franco, who of course was supported by the Italians and the Germans at this time. One of the young people who joined up was George Orwell. He actually joined a Catalan anarchist brigade, and he wrote a wonderful book called Homage to Catalonia. Have you read that? That George Orwell is a good example of somebody who did not go on thinking that the Soviet Union had, was paradise, because he wrote, as you know, amongst other things, 1984, An Animal Farm. Ernest Hemingway was there as well, too old now. He would have been 45, 50, and of course heavily drunk most of the time, but he went as a reporter. He was also in the Spanish Civil War. Incidentally, when we're talking about Soviet support for the Republican government in the Civil War, Stalin did supply them with military aid, but he demanded payment in gold. And by the time Franco actually finally took over, it was discovered that most of Spain's gold reserves had been transferred to Moscow. And there are other stories about the support, which we can't go into now. Just briefly, I want to come on because our theme here is 10 days and 100 years, and look at what has happened since that heady period, the interwar period. By the late 1930s, Bolshevik Russia no longer existed. That idealistic, frightening, innovative dynamo. It was far from withering away. The Soviet state had never been more powerful. It was 100% nationalized. It was heavily industrialized. Its agriculture was collectivized. It was in the process of being purged of millions and millions, or we don't quite know how many, of Stalin's enemies, and particularly of his old Bolshevik colleagues. A world power in the making, it most certainly was, and a world power with a revolutionary pedigree and with Stalin's own version of Bolshevik ideology as its religion, the state religion. Irina showed a very interesting picture yesterday of the Second Congress of Soviets meeting during the revolution, and in it was a very colorful picture, obviously painted during the Stalin period, because you see Lenin is standing and looking, and everyone's greeting him, and he's busy lecturing them about something. Standing right at his side, bright as anything, is Stalin. Trotsky, of course, is nowhere to be seen, whereas if you read John Reed, Trotsky is the person who really, more than anybody really, was the public face of the revolution at the time. Anyway, that's just a little sideline about Stalin and how the myth-making of the cult of the personality that could go on. As far as outsiders were concerned, the Soviet Union was almost a normal member of the international community at this time, but of course in very abnormal times. Western governments were so suspicious of it, so that when the war was clearly coming, Hitler was rearming. They didn't, when they probably could have done, sign some sort of deal with the Soviet Union which would, of course, have had Hitler hemmed in on both sides. And, of course, what happened, as we know, just before the World War... Oh, sorry, I do want to show you this. I'll show you this partly because it's a civil war and it's a very nice poster, also because it's got a woman with a gun. I feel very aware that I'm showing you mainly pictures of men in this. So there's a woman really doing her thing in the Spanish Civil War. They're in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which was the American brigade within the International Brigade. And there they are. They shall not pass. But just to return to 1939, you will remember, I'm sure, that just before war broke out on the 1st of September, actually, 1939, the week before, the Germans and the Soviets announced that they had signed a 10-year non-aggression pact. Now, it's a cartoon from Lowe, who was a great cartoonist in the Evening Standard in England at the time. If you can't read what it says, Hitler is saying the scum of the earth, I believe. And Stalin is saying the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. And lying, of course, at the bottom, prostrate, is Poland. So there we are. That's the story there. In the war, and I'm moving on quickly now, I think it's true to say, and you see it very much in today's Russia, and those of you who've been to Russia, I think will agree with me about this, that victory in World War II, in the Great Patriotic War, as it's called in Russia always, is, the most sacred concept. It is enormously important. Everybody feels that this is, they have to talk about Russia and feel about it, is that they won this war. They didn't win it single-handedly, and although sometimes you might think they did. On the 9th of May, which is Victory Day in Russia, the display of power in Red Square is enormous. You've probably seen pictures of that. During the Soviet period, it was also an enormous parade, but there would have been another one on the 7th of November, which was to commemorate the Bolshevik Revolution. I just wanted to say that I found this picture, I think it is so touching. Apart from all the tanks and all the things you always see, you see old people, and of course their numbers are becoming fewer and fewer now, with all their medals on from the Great Patriotic War. People give them flowers. They always walk around with carnations like that. It is a great thing in the Russian mind, in the way Russians look at themselves now. Most recently, just this year, a film has come out called Panfilov's 28 about the defense of Moscow in 1941. You may remember that the Germans invaded and they just went knife through butter right the way through Belarus, right through Russia, and they got to the outskirts of Moscow in October 1941, and then there was one hell of a resistance and a huge fight, and eventually they were fought off. They did not take Moscow. And all the people of Moscow turned out to defend their city. And there was a particularly famous brigade of 28 men, commanded by a man called Panfilov, and there's just been a film about it. There are questions about its historical accuracy, actually. But what I'm saying now is in Putin's Russia, all these years later, this is a great way of stirring up sentiment and a feeling of Russianness and of standing alone against the outside world. But they weren't really standing alone against the outside world because there was Lend-Lease, apart from all sorts of other things. 20 million people died during World War II in Russia. They have every reason to feel, and it is correct, that they sacrificed enormously, but they did do it with some help. It's true that in 1941, in the defense of Moscow, 30 or 40% of the tanks, including this one, were actually supplied by Britain. And later on, American tanks and other equipment became absolutely crucial. But of course, it was always an alliance of desperate convenience on both sides. I think it's true to say that both Churchill and Roosevelt underestimated Stalin, and particularly underestimated his intentions for Eastern Europe and how they were going to deal with it. Can you see that says trouble with some of the pieces and what they are doing? Oh, sorry, I'm always doing this. Here we are. What they are doing is the pieces are Eastern Europe, trying to make a jigsaw together here. And as we know, what happened after the war was that the Soviets, despite the so-called Yalta Declaration of Liberated Europe, which promised free elections of governments responsive to the will of the people, the countries of Eastern Europe were occupied by the Red Army in the course of fighting, pushing the Germans out, and then the Red Army just stayed. I'm not going to talk about the Cold War, but I did want to cover the 100 years in any detail at all. But we all, I think in this room, there are very few of us who can't remember quite a lot of the Cold War period, in which the Soviet Union, together with the United States, were the two superpowers, and Europe was divided between East and West. And it's a period when Soviet influence was spreading worldwide through anti-capitalist revolutions and conflicts. There wasn't conflict between America and Russia, but there were an awful lot of proxy wars. The Chinese Marxist Revolution of 1949 was obviously immensely important and a great boost to the Soviet Union, even though China and the Soviet Union did not remain friends for more than 10 years. Then we know about Cuba. Of course, Castro has only recently died now, which is extraordinary. And the way in fact both America and the Soviet Union in this period were fighting the Cold War with influence and with everything that they could all over the world. Now, the interesting thing coming back to relations between Russia, the Soviet Union and the West is that after Stalin died in 1953, and particularly after 1956 when Khrushchev really became supreme in Russia, there was a thaw, a temporary thaw perhaps, and we all felt that, relations were going to become much closer and much easier to understand. This is that's Anthony Eden on the steps of number 10, and he is seeing Mr. Bulganin and Mr. Khrushchev at the back into the car on their visit. I can remember it well. The evening papers in London called them bulge and crush. To me, this was a sign, when I think about it now, that they were trying to domesticate what was had been a very frightening image, particularly for England. We sat between the Americans on one side and the Russians on the other, and we all had a feeling the bombs might land on us, if they ever did land. So it was a sort of, people were trying to sort of understand the Soviet Union and make it seem more comfortable somehow, but of course they didn't. Their Western visitors were able to visit the USSR for the first time, really. It was pretty impossible under Stalin, even if you'd wanted to go. Under Khrushchev, they went. I think they found a very curious mixture of a sort of very nationalistic country and with sort of internationalist tones still about the brotherhood of the proletariat worldwide and so on, and anti-colonialism, and a lot of communist slogans, also a much lower standard of living. I went for the first time in 1962 as a student, and I loved it. I was passionately excited by everything that I saw, but it struck me, I couldn't understand, having studied to a certain extent what the Soviet Union was all about, that there was such a strong Russian nationalism imbued in all this. That didn't come through when you were outside the country, but it came through very much when I was there, as did the fact that the music was years behind and the kids didn't know how to dance. We kept being invited, my student delegation, to dance with Soviet students, and they hadn't a clue. But it was a great experience. So the funny thing is that despite the fact that in the decades after this, in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, the Soviet economy was actually imploding and stagnating. The posture from the outside looked as though the Soviet Union was still impregnable. And what fascinates me in terms of what we look at now is that Sovietologists, people who really knew all about the Soviet Union and went there or not, in the 80s were still not predicting what happened when Mr. Gorbachev took power in 1985, when Mr. Gorbachev became Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party and actually stood there and said, comrades, we have a problem, our economy is in a mess, what are we going to do about it? And the outcome was Perestroika, the book that I mentioned to you first, or early on. And Gorbachev, amongst many other reforms, of course, and totally altered the posture towards the outside world. And here, if the West had been looking for somebody they could do business with, they thought at last they'd found it. And Mrs. Thatcher was immensely pleased. So was Mr. Reagan. So was Chancellor Kohl and other Western leaders too. They thought they'd got a man they could do business with. But what happened? The Soviet Union collapsed. You all know that reform which Gorbachev brought in, led, sadly in many ways, and certainly for him, to the collapse of the whole Soviet Union and of the communist mirage, I suppose you would call it. And it led, sadly for Russia, which split, and it became the largest of the 15 former republics of the USSR, and it's the state we know today as Russia. It still covers almost 1/6 of the world's land surface. Under Mr. Yeltsin, who became president of Russia in the 1990s, sadly, it became a sort of laughingstock almost. People said, ha ha, we've all been so frightened of Russia, and look, it's an absolute mess, and we know how to put it right. And all the Western experts went in and said, oh, you've got to dismantle all those industries, and you'll have to give people shares. And there was a great deal, I think, a very insensitive handling of the Russians in the 1990s. And although within Yeltsin's government were some good people who knew what to do and were willing to work towards making Russia into an efficient country and a real democracy, it unfortunately went hand in hand with a feeling of being humiliated. This has gone through to this day without any doubt at all. So in 2000, Mr. Yeltsin, who by then, this must be quite early on, this picture, because he looks very perky, he was ill and he handed over, as you know, power, and there was an election, and Vladimir Putin, still in power now, was elected as president. And Putin's great promise to the Russian people was to make Russia great again. Sounds like someone else we know. It's amazing, isn't it? They really are going to get on, I think. Can they both become great at once? We shall see. And making Russia great again is still the basis of Russian foreign policy, formal statements, official statements to this day. And many factors have played to his advantage. Russia is a much more powerful state today than it was in 2000 when he took over. Russia is, again, undoubtedly a major player in international affairs. And Putin believes, in fact, that the West is in inevitable decline and that Russia will triumph. And Russia is, I think, still, and this cover from The Economist, you may have seen it a few months ago, I think shows Russia has become, again, a puzzle and a rather frightening prospect for the West. So as the 100th year of the Bolshevik Revolution approaches, I've tried to show that the West's current difficulty, which it undoubtedly has, in dealing with Putin's Russia, has got very deep roots, of which the Bolshevik Revolution is certainly the most significant in recent history. Since 1917, as we've seen, I hope, every sign that a reasonable Russia was about to emerge to do business with the West has proved illusory. And despite Donald Trump's belief that he and Putin will be friends, the future of relations between Russia and the West, I think, is very cloudy. And of course, one has to bear in mind that the world is a much more complicated one these days than it was in the days of the Cold War. We have a multipolar world. Many countries have nuclear weapons. It's a very unstable world. I don't need to tell you any more about that. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope I've made the international dimension a little clearer. There are a couple of minutes for questions if anybody would like a question or a comment. Yes?
Do you know whether they're going to celebrate the revolution?
Yeah, are they going to celebrate the centenary? Well, apparently yes. There is a general acceptance that they will do so, and but there are various thoughts, of course. You must remember the Communist Party. We talked about how funny it is that the Communist Party still exists in America. There's still a very strong Communist Party in Russia. And the Communist Party itself will certainly, it always marches on the 7th of November, for instance, anywhere in Red Square, they will certainly be celebrating. I read an extraordinary article somewhere recently about a lot of the sort of Moscow elite. They'd set up a sort of, almost like a nightclub, where they were going to celebrate the centenary. So I gather too that Mr. Putin believes that it should be celebrated. He's not against this at all. Irina is nodding. Commemorating, not, okay, different. Not celebrated, commemorated. Okay, I think that's a very good distinction. So yes, it is going to be, and we'll have to look and see. There'll probably be, depending on who the people are, there'll be different ways of doing it. Anyone else? Yes.
You mentioned that very few Western, let's say, leaders truly understand Russia. But during the period you've been talking about, the one diplomat that perhaps understood Russia best was George F. Kennan.
Yeah. Yes, I would indeed. And in preparation for this lecture, I read various things. Kennan's, the most accessible book, but George F. Kennan was an American diplomat stationed in Moscow during the Second World War. At the end of the war, he wrote what was always known as the Long Telegram, in which he looked at the situation in Russia and he said, well, they seem to be extremely unreasonable, but they will certainly understand force. And what he advised the Truman administration was to go for what effectively became the doctrine of containment. He also wrote an article, because he was still in the State Department, it was anonymous, in Foreign Affairs the following year, about this. And he then went on actually to be an academic. And I met him once. He, oddly enough, came to South Africa in the 1960s, to Wits, and I met him there. And his book, Russia and the West Under Lenin and Stalin, has certainly been one of the books that I've been looking at and reading. So yes, I think he did. But he was, if you like, understanding Russia at the height of the Cold War. He was understanding insofar as he could what Stalin and the Kremlin meant to the West and Turkey. Those were the so-called Central Powers. And Russia was far less well prepared for war than were its Western allies, and certainly than the Germans. In everything other than sheer numbers, it was often known as the Russian steamroller, simply because they had, through a vast conscription mechanism, almost an endless supply of under-trained and under-equipped soldiers that they could bring to the front, but very ill-prepared in many ways. When the first revolution, which we talked about yesterday, the February Revolution occurred in 1917, Russia was already in deep trouble. The Germans were making deep inroads into Russia, a great offensive against the Austro-Hungarians in Eastern Europe had failed recently. And so when the February Revolution occurred, it was warmly welcomed by Britain and France, because what they saw was people that they thought they could really do business with. The people who led the February Revolution, which the Tsar abdicated, were Democrats. They promised to make Russia into a real parliamentary democracy, a country which the West would be far more easily able to understand and deal with. And so they recognized the provisional government of Russia very quickly as the legal government of Russia. And the provisional government promised, and this was an extremely unpopular promise in Russia, to keep Russia in the war against the Germans. Now, just at about this time, February, March, April of 1917,
international affairs, she took several high-profile tours to Russia, and she knows Russia, some parts of Russia better than I do. As for Russian studies, Dr. Piner is the best specialist in Russia, Russian politics, and Russian history that South Africa has produced. So, here we go.
That was extreme. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Oh, good. Well, one of the great joys of my professional life, from which I can now look back on rather a few decades, I think one of the greatest privileges and pleasures that I have had in being around when South Africa and Russia resumed they never had a relationship much before, but when diplomatic relations were founded in 1991 and 2, was that I got to know some Russian academics very well, including dear Irina, who I think we're all very privileged to have with us here in Cape Town, and her colleague Apollon Davidson, with whom she has written several books, apart from books on her own, on South Africa and Russia. And I'll be actually talking from some of those as I go through this talk today. Now, the Bolshevik Revolution, looked at from an outsider's point of view. What Irina gave you yesterday was very much the insider's view, and as a foreigner, indeed, it is my privilege to give you an outsider's view of what the Bolshevik were often very paranoid about the outside world. And although in the centuries that followed this embassy here, there were links, a lot of links between the West and Russia, increasingly in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Marquis de Custine, who went to Russia in the 1830s and wrote a lengthy book called Letters from Russia, said, and he was looking at the court of Nicholas I, who wasn't one of the more amiable monarchs that Russia's had on the throne, "I found only the reign of silence maintained by fear." This was Custine in the early 19th century, a rather democratic-minded Frenchman, having a look at the way Russia was run. Nevertheless, because of Russia's size, because of its military strength, at least in terms of numbers, because of its great natural wealth above all, obviously it was too big to be ignored. And by 1914, and of course there were, as you know, were attempts to invade it. The Swedes in the 17th century and early 18th century, of course Napoleon in the 19th century, and by 1914, when World War I broke out, which brings us up to what we're really talking about, despite many obvious defects, Russia was one of the 5 European great powers, ruled by, as we saw yesterday, what I would call a reactionary and dim-witted Tsar, but nevertheless one of the great 5 powers and an ally in World War I of Britain and France. That was the line-up, if you like, in 1914. Russia, Britain and France on one side, leaving a few minor states out of it, and on the other side, Germany, Austria-Hungary. Revolution has meant, and particularly what it has meant to the West, by which, for the purposes of this lecture, because it's a very loose term, because of my areas of research and so on, I really do mean Western Europe and the United States of America, what the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution has been, particularly on Western Europe and the United States of America. And it has certainly been one of the most significant events of the 20th century, if not, many people would say, the most significant event of the 20th century, the Bolshevik Revolution. If you think of it, at the time, there was a terrible world war going on, and in the middle of it, this cataclysmic revolution happened, whose leaders promised to make no less than 1/6 of the world's land surface, which is what the Russian Empire was, into a completely different country, one with a society and a political system which had never been seen in the world before, based on the theory of someone called Karl Marx and others, who people perhaps knew a little bit about. And what is more, a country that was by its very nature inimical to everything that Western governments at the time stood for. So it came as something of a shock, but it came in the middle of a world war. So maybe at the time it was just one of many shocks. Now, I'm going to take a slightly different line and say, yes, it was a very significant event, quite possibly the most important of the 20th century. But where Russia's relations with the West are concerned, my view is that the West has always found Russia very difficult to deal with. Its search for a reasonable Russia to do business with, as Mrs. Thatcher put it, started centuries ago, when links first developed between Western Europe and Russia. It went certainly long before 1917, and with Mr. Putin, who a lot of people think about today, it still continues today. So the Bolshevik Revolution complicated things, but it's always been a tricky relationship. Here, for instance, is shortly after Russia and the West really started to sort of link up together in the 1600s, a delegation of Russian merchants and princes to some of the German principalities. And if you read contemporary accounts, you will see that people found the Russians very different from themselves. It wasn't so terribly geographically far, but here were people who dressed quite differently, who were very suspicious of the outside world, who in many ways, and this is something that is a theme that runs through the way the West looks at Russia and in the way Russia looks at itself, sort of Eurasian, not purely European, but with a strong Asian element to it. a country that was subject to the Russian Orthodox Church, unfamiliar in many ways within the Christian community, governed by capricious and very tyrannical rulers. At this time, Ivan IV, better known to us outsiders as Ivan the Terrible, a very terrifying ruler indeed, was on the throne in Moscow. So capricious and all-powerful rulers, and often